one of the richest regions in the world, endowed with an abundance of natural resources and mineral wealth. But this also made it a magnet for white settlers. In this episode, a member of the family of the great Zulu king Shaka relates the Zulus' heroic resistance to European colonizers, though ultimately they failed.
This was really a time of great tragedy during this period in African history.
And we also see how white domination spelled disaster for the African. The Cape in southern Africa. The original inhabitants here were the Khoi, sometimes called the Khoi. They were pastoralists, and the San, who were hunter-gatherers. Nishada Ndango works at the San Conservation Centre outside Cape Town.
Usually the youngsters, they don't practice the culture anymore. Only the elders, they dance and they sing. The youth will be there, but they will stand and watch them doing it. That's why it is important to practice, because I see that if all the elders, San people die, and then I see that our language and our culture will distinct. That's why I say that it is very important if we learn it.
But from the mid-1600s, the centuries-old way of life of the San and Khoi peoples was irrevocably disrupted when Europeans arrived in the Cape, which lies strategically at Cape Agulhas, the point where the Atlantic meets the Indian Ocean. In the early 1650s, the Dutch East India Company launched a small expedition led by Dutchman Jan van Riebeck. He arrived in what is today Cape Town and established a settlement here, and it was a useful trade route east for the spice trade. In order to consolidate their position, the Dutch East India Company built this castle here in Cape Town. The fortress consists of a church, living quarters, workshops, amongst other buildings, and it was completed in 1679 and indeed is the oldest building in South Africa. First, the Khoi and San people welcomed these Europeans. They traded with them and supplied them with provisions. And whilst their numbers were modest, there didn't seem to be much of a problem. But soon these Europeans, who were Dutch but were also German and French, began to farm and expand into the land of the Khoi and San. They became known as free burghers. South African historian Dr. Tula Simpson describes relations between the Khoi and Europeans.
What is significant about this from the Khoi perspective is that initially it's a trading relationship and it's a mutually beneficial relationship. That begins to change about 5 years into the Dutch occupation of the Cape Peninsula, when they start trying to establish agricultural land holdings in order to produce their own goods to refresh the ships going around the Cape. And that leads to conflict, because what that is viewed as from the Khoi perspective is the alienation of their ancestral lands. So the expansion into the interior starts encroaching on the Khoi way of life.
Professor Nigel Penn says the Khoi were looked down upon by the Europeans.
The first impressions recorded by Europeans of the Khoi were on the whole very unflattering. They regarded the Khoi as being the epitome of savagery, and their descriptions highlighted everything that to a European signified savagery. And the reason for these very negative impressions is largely, prejudice rather than objective observation.
They lost a lot of their land, and the consequence of losing a lot of their land is that their ruling authorities and their leaders lost their prestige, their political structures went into decline, there were opportunities created for divide and rule tactics, and there was a disintegration of the Khoi society as well. Amongst the other things which are exchanged are diseases, and one of them is smallpox, and that is a major cause of large-scale death amongst the Khoi in the late 17th and early 18th century.
And the Khoi began to say to the Europeans, why are you ploughing up the land? Why don't you go back to your own country? What would you think if we came to your country and began to take over your land?
So, conflict was now inevitable. Driven from their traditional lands, killed by newly introduced diseases, the Africans tried to fight back against the Europeans and their guns.
They had no effective answer against the superior military technology of the Europeans. They had to try and use the terrain as far as possible and to try and engage the Dutch at close quarters. They didn't have guns themselves. It was very unequal contest.
They were so subjugated, so weakened, that they were forced to work for Dutch settlers for extremely low wages, in some cases no wages at all, or simply food and clothing. So the Khoi became the oppressed subordinate labor force of the Dutch settlers.
The San people, however, were seen as being less useful and suffered even more than the Khoi.
The San, on the other hand, being hunter-gatherers, were not valued as laborers. In fact, they were regarded as a threat to livestock because they hunted, and the San were regarded very often as a form of vermin that ought to be exterminated. And so frequently commandos were sent out against San, or hunter-gatherers, who had killed the livestock of the colonists, and these San were hunted down and killed, exterminated. You might say there was almost a genocidal warfare waged against hunter-gatherer resistors. Normally the San men were killed, but the women and children would be spared, and they would be absorbed as laborers, domestic servants. Thousands of San were killed in these genocidal wars of deliberate destruction of San society.
However, there was resistance in both the San and Khoi communities. The Khoi were depicted here by early Dutch illustrators. One leading opponent was the Khoi chief Outschumau. He was initially an interpreter for the Dutch before turning against them in 1659. Outschumau was imprisoned on Robben Island off the Cape, but managed to escape. He died in 1663, a broken man who'd been unable to secure freedom for his people. The Dutch also imprisoned resistance fighters at the castle in Cape Town once it had been built. I make my way there to meet Andre Naidu, a community activist who shows me one of the cells where people were held and tortured.
You have the choice of either get here or go back into the fields, not as an owner of the land, but now to be a slave for a new master. And you can see the balls and chains.
However, the power of the Dutch began to fade in the Cape by the end of the 1700s, and the British seized control of the region in 1806. The British found thousands of local slaves, as well as labor imported from Malaya, Madagascar, and the Indian subcontinent. These groups mixed with Africans, giving rise to a new community later referred to as the Cape Coloureds.
When the British first arrived, they conquered the Cape by military force, and they proved, I suppose, they were militarily superior to the Dutch settlers, and the Dutch East Indies Company no longer existed. So most of the Dutch accepted that they had a new government, and they were prepared to tolerate that government as long as it kept order, and especially helped them on the frontiers to fight the African societies and to keep order amongst the Khoi and the San. They became unpopular when they introduced 4,000 or 5,000 British settlers into the Eastern Cape, who became, in a way, rivals.
So, from 1834, thousands of Dutch settlers began to leave the British-controlled Cape for areas in the interior. This mass movement of settlers is known as the Great Trek. The settlers, or burghers, as the European farmers were called, moved north and east to regions such as KwaZulu-Natal, the land of the Zulus. The Dutch settlers travelled in their wagons, armed with their guns and carrying their Bibles. These were the first of the Boer trekkers, or trek Boers, and that means wandering farmers in Afrikaans. Now, this word was later shortened to just the Boers. Afrikaans is the name given to the version of Dutch spoken by the Boer settlers.
Once the Boers had established themselves as republics in the interior of South Africa, they were always regarded as being a bit of an obstacle or threat to the British project of imperialism.
This rivalry led to a series of battles between them known as the Boer Wars, which began in the late 19th century. The conflict between white settlers in what is today South Africa is interesting and critical, but this series is based on UNESCO's General History of Africa, which focuses on the African perspective of history on the continent. So, let us now turn to a significant chapter, the rise of the Zulu kingdom in the early 19th century. The Zulus are amongst the best known of Africa's ethnic groups, and they were to encounter the Boers and the British as they increasingly established themselves in their territories. The most famous figure of the Zulu was the son of a chief of a small clan. In 1819, he had established himself as the ruler of a single, all-powerful kingdom. He was in his early 30s, and his name was Shaka. In the space of a few years, Shaka had extended his domain across modern-day KwaZulu-Natal. I go there to find out more about the Zulu way of life. Bongi Tabade, a Zulu herself, is a guide based in Durban, the capital of KwaZulu-Natal.
These are called amaqukwane. Those are the huts that are used by the Zulu people. As you can see, they are made out of thatch grass or yellow grass, and you can find it growing all over KwaZulu-Natal. The women will cut it, and they will be the ones who will actually thatch it. The men will then do the structure.
In the 19th century, the Zulus were essentially pastoralists, weren't they? How did they divide the labor between them?
Livestock was very important in the lives of the Zulus because we would use goats, we would use a cow when we perform our rituals, and also it provided meat for the family. The women would go to the fields, they will plow the fields, they will plant the crop, they will clean the huts, the homestead. Also, the women were responsible for raising the kids. The men will make sure that the family is protected.
And you're wearing, I see, some wonderful beads. Beads are very important,
of course,
for the Zulus.
Very
even
colorful.
From the 19th century. I mean, King Shaka, for example, beads were a very important thing in his life.
Yes, in the olden days, though, because we didn't have the glass beads, that only came when the Zulus started to trade with the sailors who were coming through on ships.
I've been told I can see some beaded jewellery and other items dating back to the time of King Shaka. They're on display at the Fancy Museum in Durban. This is a medicine bottle, a fertility doll, and a chest decoration of the kind worn by Zulu kings in the 19th century. Most of the descriptions of Shaka during his lifetime do not come from African sources, as Dr. Tula Simpson explains.
The sources were from European traders and European missionaries writing their accounts and translating Zulu folklore about the great King Shaka and his achievements and his military prowess. And those are the sources that have been transmitted to us as far as that is concerned.
So in your view, are they slanted?
I do think that they're definitely slanted, and there are ways in which it has been slanted to justify European colonialism.
So the depictions we have of this rather cruel figure, in your view, isn't necessarily supported by African sources?
That's correct.
In 1836, one British adventurer, Nathaniel Isaacs, wrote to a fellow author advising him to smear Shaka and his successors. Make them out to be as bloodthirsty as you can, he urged. Shaka developed a centralized kingship, quashing internal opposition and launching a military campaign against rival communities in what was known as the Mfakane, or the Crushing.
It's the name given for a series of wars, and the status of that period in history is contested amongst historians at the moment because it creates a very convenient myth from the colonial point of view, which is the idea that black-on-black conflict created a depopulated interior in which whites could move into empty land.
But the Mfakane really did lead to a scattering of many, and they left the territories that they had lived in for many, many centuries.
But in a sense, this is a continuation of a pattern that's been continuing for a number of centuries.
Zulu traditions have endured for hundreds of years, and today the Zulus are renowned for their distinctive dance and militaristic style. I arranged to meet a Zulu prince, Mangosuthu Buthelezi. As leader of the Inkatha Freedom Party, he was known as Chief Buthelezi and was a pivotal figure in South African politics before and after apartheid. King Shaka was his great-great-great-uncle on his mother's side, Princess Mgogo. As a graduate of history, Chief Mangosuthu likes to relate his family story.
King Shaka actually is, I would almost say that he's revered by the Zulu people as the founding father of the Zulu nation, and as someone who made us who we are, the Zulu people.
King Shaka introduced the notion of celibacy amongst his soldiers. They were kept in barracks and were expected to remain chaste for as long as 10 years.
Yes.
That was quite a remarkable thing to introduce.
But I suppose acceptable for them for those times. You see, because we look at it through our modern eyes, and at that time, the people accepted it and he accepted it.
Oh, was King Shaka celibate?
He was a celibate, yes.
Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi tells me King Shaka is credited with inventing the short spear, which was much more effective as a fighting tool than the long one.
People used to throw spears at each other. That was how warfare took place during the time. And then he came up with a short spear, meaning that you must confront, your enemy, face to face, and fight.
And Shaka also devised the bullhorn fighting formation, which the chief describes.
Some army people went this way, and others on the other side to make a circle to finish off the...
To converge,
yes.
So there would be no means of escape.
Yes, they would either led by generals this side and some on the other side, until they completely encircle the enemy or target.
I'm here in Kwaduguza, about 70 kilometers north of Durban, and this is where Shaka established his capital. Kwaduguza in the Zulu language means place of the lost person. In the end, it was not on the battlefield that King Shaka met his death. On September the 24th, 1828, Shaka was sitting on this rock awaiting visitors. Two of his half-brothers, Dingane and Mhlangana, along with Shaka's servant, Mbopa, approached him carrying spears. According to one historical account, one of the brothers, aiming for Shaka's heart, instead hit him in the arm. Shaka got up, tried to walk away, but they stabbed him repeatedly in the back until they killed him. However, according to Zulu tradition, Shaka did not try to resist his attackers. Shaka's body was then wrapped in the skin of a black ox and buried. And years later, his body was moved to this site behind me. And this marble monument is a legacy to Shaka, who epitomizes the African fighter, a symbol of courage and military prowess that brought Shaka fame that spread far and wide.
We still mourn him because we think that with the kind of mind and genius that he was, we say that he would have taken Zulu people even further than he succeeded in uniting them. And therefore, although King Dingane was given the same respect as a king, but there's always a feeling that, what he did was actually disloyal and actually that it was wrong to end the life of such a genius at the prime of life.
So even in death, you think he was brave? He didn't resist? He didn't try to run away?
No, he didn't run away, no. In fact, he prophesied then, even if you kill me, you'll not rule. He predicted the coming of whites into the kingdom and taking over the whites.
One big impact of Shaka's reign is that the Mfecane, or crushing, helped mould the map of southern Africa as it is today. After the Mfecane, various chiefs fled elsewhere and established new kingdoms, such as in modern-day Lesotho and Mozambique. In part of what became Zimbabwe, one chief founded the Ndebele Kingdom in Matabeleland. Bulawayo is its main town, and this is where I meet Patisa Nyasi, a cultural expert who tells me about this king, Mzilikazi.
King Mzilikazi, as some people will say, was probably the second greatest fighter and leader after King Shaka. He defied King Shaka. He refused to fall under King Shaka. He said, I will create my own nation.
There's a direct descendant of King Mzilikazi whom Patisa wants me to meet. She's a teacher and storyteller, Musa Dungeni.
Mzilikazi was a very clever king. I would say he was a unifier. He was very kind. However, the stories that actually say something about him usually would be told by my own parents. Now that I'm also a grandmother, I do tell stories.
Give us one.
I'll tell you a story about a mamba, a big snake, and Idwangu. Idwangu is a?
It's a papoon.
It's a papoon. Where
Musa Dungeni tells us a long story about an encounter between these three animals. She says the fable illustrates how King Mzilikazi set an example of how a leader should behave.
he should be able to honor his word. No. In our tradition, he is always the clever one who solves things.
These are people that you want to emulate, legendary figures, so that the young, growing children are learning values from such people. Selfless, dedicated, brave people were able to build a nation like King Mzilikazi.
Mzilikazi and Shaka are amongst the most iconic of southern African rulers. After the break, we see how Shaka's prophecy that the Zulu kingdom would fall under the control of the white settlers would come to pass, and what this meant for the Africans. The Zulu kingdom with its heart in KwaZulu-Natal in modern-day South Africa. The great King Shaka was succeeded in 1828 by Dingane, the brother who had murdered him. But Dingane lacked Shaka's leadership qualities, and the Zulu kingdom became depleted and its soldiers undisciplined. Dingane's brother Mpande, who became king in 1840, managed to rebuild the Zulu kingdom. When Mpande died, he was succeeded by Sitshwayo, his 40-year-old son. Sitshwayo was tall, broad-chested, with regal bearing. He invited the British representative, Theophilus Shepstone, to his coronation, who described him as
a man of considerable ability, much force of character, and has a dignified manner. In all conversations with him, he was remarkably frank and straightforward. He is naturally proud of the military traditions of his family, especially the policy and deeds of his uncle and predecessor, Shaka.
But Shepstone proved to be a fickle friend and turned on the king, deciding to seize his lands. Sitshwayo expressed his concern.
I hear of troops arriving in Natal, that they are coming to attack the Zulus and to seize me. What have I done wrong that I should be seized like an umtakata? The English are my fathers. I do not wish to quarrel with them, but to live as I have always done, at peace with them.
The British told King Sitshwayo that he had to disband his army, knowing he would never agree, thus giving them a pretext for war. In January 1879, British forces crossed into the Zulu kingdom at Rorke's Drift and selected a giant rocky outcrop called Isandwana. Here they were attacked by a Zulu force of 20,000. 870 British soldiers were killed, only 55 survived. It was a significant victory for King Sitshwayo, who is the great-great-grandfather of Mangosuthu Buthelezi.
I think King Sitshwayo is one of our greatest kings. Because you must remember that without any provocation, the British attacked him. He started to sue for peace unsuccessfully because there were such warmongers who said the Zulu power must be broken once and for all. And of course, he is revered because regiments were only carrying spears and cowhides. We always celebrate the great victory where the king's army routed the British.
But the celebrations were short-lived. A few months after the iconic Zulu achievement at Isandwana, the British retaliated. The Zulus were subjected to a massive attack at the Battle of Ulundi in July 1879. 1,500 Zulus were killed. 13 died on the British side. The kingdom built by Shaka Zulu was now in British hands. After his defeat at Ulundi, King Sitshwayo was held captive by the British and his kingdom was broken up. Those Zulus who had sided with the British were rewarded.
On the 4th of July 1879, where the Zulu people were vanquished, they burnt down the king's palace and so on.
And King Sitshwayo was taken captive and imprisoned in Cape Town.
He was a prisoner in Cape Town in the castle with his wives, and then King Sitshwayo tried to plead with Her Majesty Queen Victoria to be allowed to get back to his kingdom. It was terrible what they did, because they divided the kingdom into 13, and they installed what were called kinglets in each one of them. There were several civil wars as a result of what the British did, in which thousands of our people died.
Sitshwayo himself died in 1884. These accounts of Zulu history are remembered today through song, stories, and dance.
Well, Zulu people, song is part of our culture. There are songs for young people, lullabies, which are sung, for babies. Then we've got hymns, which are serious ones, which are sung on very special ceremonial
God help us.
occasions.
You're going to show us the Zulu dance?
When they were young people, they're young people.
I like that. Can you show me how you do that?
Hamba. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hamba ganegaba. Hamba. Hamba. Hamba ganegaba.
Of the Zulus and other communities at this time provided white settlers with the security that enabled them to exploit the diamonds and gold of the whole southern African region.
What really changes South African history is the discovery of diamonds and gold in the 1870s and 1880s, which leads to industrialization and urbanization and shifts the economic center of gravity of the region from the Cape, which had been significant for its role in international trade routes, to the interior, which is a major source of mineral wealth globally. What you see initially is a very great opportunity because these are areas of wealth, and initially it takes time for the color line to be established and discrimination to be entrenched. Africans, the mines were a place where you could go to earn some hard currency, which you could then bring back and purchase firearms and land and become an important figure there. There was a period of openness and exchange, which was the first period. The period when there is an attempt to establish structure and organization is where the system of white supremacy and black inferiority is established. And it's that system which is then established and extended across the South African territorial space.
The Europeans wanted labor from the Africans, but not African competition.
That's correct. So you had wars of conquest in the areas surrounding the diamond fields in order to secure them. As you got that land encroachment, you had land scarcity being created, and people had to come out and offer their services for ever lower wages.
I'm in Kimberley, which is the capital of Northern Cape Province, where diamonds were first discovered in what is today South Africa. Now, diamonds are crystals made of carbon, which form naturally at about 150 kilometers below the Earth's surface over billions of years. They are the hardest substance known to humankind. By the 19th century, they were the most precious of all gemstones. So the mine here at Kimberley was opened in 1871 and it ceased to operate in 1914. But by then, it had yielded nearly 3 tons of diamonds. That's about 14.5 million carats. The mine at Kimberley is known as the Big Hole. It covers 42 acres and is about 240 meters deep. And can you imagine, it was all dug out by hand by laborers who toiled and toiled to earn money to keep their families. It's tragic that they sometimes lost their lives simply for diamonds and profits for the people who owned the diamond mines. But despite the risks of working deep underground, the diamond mines attracted a constant flow of migrant workers from across southern Africa. This is a recreation of the old city of Kimberley as it was during the time of that great rush for diamonds. The shops are full of the kind of goods that would have been on display and on sale at the time. And at first you might get the impression that it's a little bit like Disneyland, but actually it's pretty evocative of that era. One of the best known of the mining magnates from that period in Kimberley's history was the Englishman Cecil Rhodes. He'd come to Southern Africa in the early 1870s as a young man and was quick to spot the opportunities to make big money. Along with his associates, Rhodes ended up owning the famous De Beers Mining Company, which made huge profits off the back of African labour. The company took its name from the farm of a Boer called Johannes de Beer, on whose land diamonds were found. Today in Kimberley, in a somewhat run-down part of the city, the highly polished brass plaque on the building where De Beers was based is in stark contrast to the drab environment around it. This Pullman coach was used by directors of the De Beers company when they were travelling along the main lines of South African railways. Now, it was built in 1898 and it was taken out of service in 1937. Clearly, the directors of De Beers enjoyed a very comfortable lifestyle. In this carriage, there's a table set for four with silver cutlery and crystal glassware and champagne on ice. And then there's also a room where the men could retire and have a drink, sherry, brandy, whiskey, and perhaps even have a cigar or two. Matabeleland in what is today Zimbabwe, where Cecil Rhodes also had extensive business interests. The son of Mzilikazi, Lobengula, had succeeded his father as king of the Ndebele people in 1870, and he had the misfortune of having to deal with Cecil Rhodes. The story of King Lobengula's betrayal is taken up by Patisa Nyasi.
We know King Lobengula to have been a calculating person, very clever, witty, and a jovial individual, but a great thinker. You could study the situation and work out the problems, the challenges that confronted him.
But he was illiterate, so when he was presented with various deals and agreements, he couldn't really work out what was in these, and he was hoodwinked by the British.
That was chicanery by Cecil John Rhodes particularly. Very, very cunning, and used to buy all the people, those that stood in his way, he bought them. Whether they were missionaries, concession seekers, he bought them all. So because he had money, he used money power to make his way through. For the Ndebele, ownership of land is communal. They didn't understand that a man can be said to own land. But he was here dealing with people with that kind of system, individual tenure, someone who say, please, get out of here. This land is now mine. The trees are mine. The soil is mine. The grass is mine. Lobengula is remembered particularly as having been the last king.
His body has never been found.
Never been found. What was important was for the Ndebele not to say he has been captured by whites. See, when you have captured the king, you have captured the nation. Now, this song is about his disappearance, because as Ndebele people, we don't say he died, he disappeared. Kudala kwakungenje, umhlaba uyaphenduka, kwakubusa umambo lomzilikazi, sawela ujangane, saguqa ngamadolo, inkosi Lobengula yasinyamalala, kwasekusini izulu yasinyamalala.
With Lobengula out of the way, Cecil Rhodes accumulated more and more wealth in this part of southern Africa and spent much time here in Bulawayo, the capital of Matabeleland, in what is today Zimbabwe. This is the very bar where Cecil Rhodes came on a regular basis for a chat or a gossip, or even to do business with other colonialists, white settlers, or just friends. It is interesting to see that actually the bar has retained many of its original features. The manager tells me black people had their own drinking area at the back of the bar at that time.
They were not allowed here. They had their own place where they used to drink, but within the same building. Yeah. The only time they would come in here is when they would have been called by their bosses.
Nigel shows me the section which the colonialists had designated for the black Africans. At the time of his death in 1902, Cecil Rhodes was one of the richest and most powerful men in Africa. Indeed, in 1895, the country that is now Zimbabwe was named after him, Rhodesia. It was at this spot, on the Matobo Hills in Bulawayo, that Cecil Rhodes was laid to rest in 1902 at the age of 48. He actually died in Cape Town in South Africa after he contracted a severe chest infection. But it was in the country that bore his name that he was buried. The immense wealth of the few, such as Cecil Rhodes, was gained at the expense of the many black Africans who were dispossessed from their lands and were confronted with a life of misery, toiling in the diamond and gold mines of southern Africa. Precious metals extracted through their sweat and labor and taken away for the benefit of others. This heavily fortified coach was used to carry gold bullion between Johannesburg, Durban and Cape Town from 1911 to 1967. And the bullion coach was built complete with kitchen facilities, a toilet and sleeping quarters. Somewhere where you can put your clothes. And then, of course, there would be the safe where the gold bullion was kept. As I stand here overlooking Pretoria, the capital of South Africa, I reflect on the fact that the history of Southern Africa is one that is very much mired in conflict over land, gold and diamonds, and that it was greed that, to such a large extent, determined the fate of the people of this region. Zimbabwean historian Dr. George Carrick-Waivanani is currently teaching in the UK.
The late 19th century was really a terrible time for many African peoples engaging with the Europeans who had now decided to move onto the continent and take it over by force. So this was a time of displacement, and those African peoples who tried to resist, unfortunately, were massacred in very tragic ways. And this was a time of land being displaced, livestock being displaced, and being forced into labor and having to pay taxes to sustain colonial systems. So this was really a time of great tragedy during this period in African history.
The gold and diamond boom in southern Africa encouraged Europeans to rush into the whole of the continent in the hope of finding precious metals. Also, owning an